Welcome to First Answers. This is episode 14 in the series Parent Leadership for 21st Century Children. Adolescence is considered a critical period in our society because teenagers' development can be impacted in so many ways. This is one reason why it is important to provide firm, flexible, conversant, and accountable parenting during these years. Learn how to successfully apply this form of parent leadership and feel more confident with your teens. Visit firstanswers.com to find more about the podcast and tons of resources for families and mental health.
In previous episodes of this series, I have indicated to you that each period of a child's life from birth to 5, from 6 to 11, 12 through 18, and then 18 through mid-20s for young adults, each had a different title or a label, and the purpose for the different labels was so that I could emphasize that essentially parenthood is being able to adapt and match your children in a lot of different ways. There's a lot of evidence, for example, that when parental leadership does not match children, either the children themselves or the environment in which they live, that is a primary source of discord between parents and children. So just in a way of review, for example, let's suppose that I review for you the names of the leadership for each of those stages. For example, we want clear, predictable, and nurturing leadership for children birth to 5, because that makes you predictable and consistent and warm, and it'll promote attachment, and the children will learn positive things better, and so it's a good adaptation to children of that age. Then I propose that what we need is to have a different kind of leadership, where it has to do with find uniqueness, so individualize your children, and create connections and a warm family kind of experience for children from 6 to 11. Well, why? Because during this period of time, children move out of the family. They go to school, have more outside family activities, and in order to be successful at educating, teaching, and helping your children learn from you, it is important to recognize their uniqueness, talk about it, think about it, help other kids recognize it, to also make connections with them of a variety of kinds, talk, visiting, love, spend time, mentor. That's when you pour it on in terms of praise and encouragement for kids. And then the warm family connections that are especially vital for children during this age period. And the reason, again, for that is so that you can help your children prior to adolescence make your family their primary point of reference, meaning that when they're making a decision, that their family will come to their mind instead of their friends or somebody on the news or somebody on the internet that they've happened to meet. And then for adolescent children, the children 12 through 18, I'm proposing that we need firm, flexible, conversant, and accountable leadership, where we bring our teenage kids into a situation where instead of imposing a large number of rules and applying parental authority, as we might have in earlier years, what we want now is to sweeten the relationship between us and our children so that it's firm, it's flexible, it's conversant, but it's also accountable in a nice and warm, considerate way. So this episode today, episode 14, is about leadership for adolescent children. I also wanted to mention that we are changing the name of this podcast to match our website. Our website is firstanswers.com, and we are currently loading the website with things that parents need but are hard to find. So, for example, we have a program on this leadership. We have one on exceptional learners, helping your children learn and be successful at school or at home. We have one on Parents' Guide to Gender Identity, and one that I'm especially interested in, which is for parents of adult children who have strayed or who have betrayed the parents. And we have another section on practical solutions. In addition to that, there are between 40 and 50 other lessons that are uniquely organized with specific objectives in mind and activities that you can use. The reason for doing that is primarily personal. I want to be involved in things having to do with parents and families because it's what interests and motivates me. It's my first love outside my own family. And because in my clinical work, I see the heartache when we do not get it right and the difficulty children have in learning how to grow up and be successful. Now, the purpose of this episode is to help you adapt what you do as a leader to match adolescent children and then to promote their growth in a substantial way because kids know it. Well, why? Well, the reason principally for that is that during this period, children make decisions that often last for the rest of their lives. They might make a small decision when they're 7 or 8, but nobody remembers that typically unless it's a traumatic event. But that's not true for adolescent children. They're making decisions about education, about relationships with people, about moral issues. And so it turns out to be important that you learn how to use the quality of your relationship with your children more and make it more important than a specific rule or a specific activity. Now, sometimes parents think that becoming a friend to a teenager is the best way to be successful. Instead, please consider that adolescent children need a thoughtful and wise parent more during this stage of life than any other stage. Involvement of both parents, if both parents are available, strengthens what you do. But it is often the case that parents will know which parent can have the most success with a given concern or child. Now, changing rules one at a time in order to create a relationship of trust, warmth, and communication makes it possible for a child to gradually grow into a sense of freedom and independence. If you keep all of the rules you started with perhaps when they're 6 or 7, in our world, unless you live in an environment that has a great deal of threat for your children, most children will perceive that as a loss of their freedom and independence, and they will not like it. So you make these adjustments along the way based on what you know about the children, based on what you know about the children's environment, and then the quality and the conditions you want in your family. Now, the teenage years are sometimes looked forward to by parents, and sometimes this stage of life seems worrisome. Adolescence still has a bad reputation in some circles. That's because in some places where social conditions are not the best, preteens as young as 10, 11, or 12 are criminals, or trying to become criminals, and teenagers are generally perceived as hard to manage. The problem is that we don't hear as much about the truly marvelous young people there are in the world because they're busy living, getting by, trying to be good, doing well in school, succeeding with friends, and so on. But as it turns out, parents often get what they expect, so pay attention to that, because if you're able to expect positive, good things with your children, that will likely be the case. Now, this does not mean, however, that the period of time between 12 and 18 is not filled with pitfalls and challenges as well as marvelous achievements and experiences. There are many of those nowadays. What it does mean, very likely, is that the individuals who are doing well are managing and resisting some of the options available to them. They're achieving. They feel mostly positive feelings, and they have adequate or more than adequate social skills. So, you could view adolescence from more than one point of view, and we suggest that you consider it to be one of the best times of your lives as parents. That is, if you can create and have a very high-quality parent-child relationship, create a warm and successful family, and then help your children traffic through the truly enormous challenges of our time. Now, to begin with, think about what you currently believe about this period of a child's life. And then check to see if you have enough knowledge available to you. Sometimes parents just have the oldest child and they learn on the oldest child and say, well, but that's not a good idea because the next child is not like the oldest child. So it is important for you to pay attention to what adolescence is, the best way to be parents to these individuals, and what the current circumstances of their lives are. So this likely means that many parents are facing this period of time without enough knowledge of the special conditions adolescence brings into a family. The risk of parental mistakes is higher here when this takes place, and therefore, I propose that completing this lesson will help you understand more about this remarkable stage of life. Now, like other stages of a child's life, parents of 21st century children I've found to be more successful, provide a form of leadership that is adapted to the children, to the external conditions, the conditions of the family, and to them as individuals. Now, adapting in this manner, which I've repeated often, and I apologize for that, but sometimes people don't understand what it means to adapt. It means to change some forms of behavior. It means to change your emotional behavior, your language, and how you treat or organize things. And so I'm going to assume that you need some help in learning how to make your leadership a good match for the events, emotions, and social conditions of your adolescent child's life. Now, it's quite common for parents to say to a teenage child, "Remember who you are." And this statement is aimed at the child, hoping to strengthen his or her resolve to not get into something harmful. The irony about this statement, however, is that the child is actually working very hard and in many different ways to discover who he or she is. And quite often, they don't know for sure. In fact, most of the time, they don't know for sure. A relatively small percentage of adolescent children actually have identity formation by 12 or 13. Very few do, and most are much later than that. So as a result, during adolescence, some try out numerous personas to see which ones match up what they suspect might be true about themselves. Not all individuals are like this, as I've mentioned. Many have good ideas around age 12 or so on, but a lot don't. And therefore, it seems wiser for you as a parent to accept your children are in the process of forming conclusions about themselves, and you can play a very significant role if you provide a high quality of leadership. Now, I've spent time with large numbers of teenage youth who are making good progress and had problems which arrested their progress. This involvement has led to us to identify, some researchers to identify qualities of parenting and family leadership which parents of successful youth seem to apply. These are the qualities of leadership that successful youth and their parents seem to apply. I have learned, for instance, that parents who consistently judge their children on outward behavior alone, whether they follow rules, what they're dressed like, whether or not they achieve at school, and so on, are more likely to make errors with their children than parents who take the time to ask about a child's feelings, a child's attitudes, and other forms of self-knowledge the child may have. So it's the combination that appears to be the best. Let's talk about what you're like on the outside and what you're like on the inside. Now, as examples of this is what time children get home, how they treat people, if they get their work done, what they look like, and so on. Understanding children's actions and their emotions, for instance, have great advantages for you, as I think you'll see. Now, I've also observed that parents who move toward a relational form of family government rather than an authority system tend to be more successful. This means that instead of retaining focus on their work and whether they follow the rules only and whether or not you apply consequences, successful parents shift somewhat away from that key part of it, but they add increased emphasis on whether the children will learn how to build trust, communicate well, show warmth and love, which are the forms of leadership. The only other form of leadership that is not mentioned here has to do with being flexible and also learning how to be firm. Now, here are some relevant facts that might help you feel more confident about adapting to being children of this age. First, children go through this period of time at different rates of development, and it is wise to adapt a little for slow developers and for early developers. There's a big difference. A girl, for example, that has a mature body at age 11 is going to need to be treated differently than a tall, willowy girl who hasn't reached her woman's body until she's 17 or 18. Number two, please keep in mind that early developers may catch on faster and appear to be the golden child and gain more praise, etc. So what this means is the slow developers, unless mistreated, get through this period of time just as successfully as anyone else, but because they don't receive the same amount of recognition or praise, often feel like they're inadequate or unworthy. 3, in this whole time, adapting to children and the conditions they face, parents who have been successful with their children tell me that they have had to be firm sometimes, flexible sometimes, but always prepared to help their children be accountable. That does not mean imposing rigid punishments. It means a conversation that says, well, here's what you said, here's what you did. Let's talk about a good way to help you learn. Now, why all of this? Well, in my opinion, it's because the challenges 21st century teenagers face require a lot of adjusting from their parents. A child may leave home in a positive mood and come home feeling something else. Or a child may have a crush on someone only to have that dashed to pieces that very day. Or if a boy or girl works part-time, goes to school, and has a social life, these individuals might be so busy and they're scrambling to keep up that they don't know how to tell the full truth all the time because they're adjusting their schedules and they don't have time to meet with you. So what? Well, you would adjust by making sure that they have some time to work, time to rest, and time to think. And if you can work that out with them, it can be a truly great time, but as I mentioned, it can be perilous too. Well, let's take a look at firm for just a minute. The comments I have made earlier is why parents of teenagers, in my opinion, will need to select some areas where you are quite firm. This might include where your children spend time, who they spend it with, getting their work done, learning and expressing moral values. Now, what does firm mean? Well, it means that when your children are faced with a choice, you expect them to think about what will help or harm someone, and you firmly wish them to choose what will help and not harm. I'm going to repeat that. You want to give them the basis for making a choice, and it has to do with part of which is what helps and hurts people. But in addition to that, it would be a good thing to teach your children to be searchers. That is, to search for information that would help them make a good decision. Firm also means that your expectations for them are respected by them. What that means is you tell them lovingly and you try to match your expectations with their talents and abilities. And you also add a great deal of encouragement rather than a lot of pressure. You can ask small amounts of pressure for your kids to do well, it's okay. Too much creates anxiety, of which there is a plague in the United States. So, this means that when you ensure that your firmness will be respected, you make adjustments away from an exclusive rule-oriented approach to invite your children to form a high-quality relationship with you. Now, if both of you agree, then you can ask your children to generate trust by saying what they'll do and then doing it. Frequently communicating well with you without being asked. They just come and talk to you and tell you things. And to be warm, considerate, and respectful. Firm does not mean control and pressure, except perhaps rarely. But why do this? Well, your relationship with your child, if it is good, is over a long time the single biggest influence on your children. It means being clear, being as consistent as possible, and frequently communicating what you as parents want and hope for your children. Next, I want to address what the term flexible means. It does not mean permissiveness or indifference. Instead, it means that you as parents have the ability to be firm, impose limits, adapt and adjust according to the circumstances, and know when to do that. Sometimes people will make a rule and think, nope, I've made it and that's how it's going to be. On other occasions, it's necessary to adjust in terms of time or be flexible and so on. Always with respect and always with accountability. But I would like to point out to you that we reserve our medals of honor typically for people who break rules, who do something to save people's lives, for example, that they weren't commanded to do. The point is there's a lot of value about rules, but they have to be flexibly applied. And it might also mean that as parents, you will have a different way of responding to a child from one situation to the next, not because you're inconsistent or uncaring, but because the child's changing situations warrant it. The word flexible, therefore, means that as a parent, you will need to hunt for alternative ways to help your children, increase your capacity for the many things required of you, and adolescents are in a situation that is more complex and require a greater variety of skills than younger children. Oh, what does that mean? It means that you spend more time learning about the people and the situations they participate in. You learn more about their inner qualities that they're faced with, their thoughts and feelings, and you take a look at your family and say, how are we doing as a family, helping it be the primary point of reference for our kids. Now, the elevated complexity of family life usually requires that you're hunting for new alternatives and have to adjust some of the routine things you've carried out. But I point out to you, this adjustment turns out largely to make the difference between what is successful and less successful parenting. Next, I want to address the idea of conversant, not communication, but conversant. So that what we're talking about is face-to-face conversations where you're looking in your child's face, child is either listening to you or looking in your face, and we're having conversations that have a wide range of variety. For example, a conversation just about the simple activities of a day, a conversation about thoughts about a child's friend, conversation about the family or what the child prefers and so on, turns out to be really important. And you might say, well, what if my child doesn't communicate with me? Well, my proposal to you is you do some of the following. You say there are some times when you don't need to communicate with me, but there are times when it's necessary, and here are some of those times. Number one, I want to know about you, and I'm not willing to go through life missing everything, so I'd appreciate you informing me so I can participate and hug and cheer and do all sorts of things. Number two, I want to converse when there's a possibility of miscommunicating with you, and I want to talk about it so it doesn't drag on and on. Possibility three is that I want to communicate with you and be conversant about the important decisions of your life. I want you to come and be able to feel free with me, to be able to say, what about this, what about that, and so on. I do not want to control your life. I do want to be informed about it, and if possible, I'd like to make a suggestion here or there. In addition, that after a child makes a mistake and you're regrounding them or something, and they say, okay, now let's talk about it, and you don't want to or they don't want to, well, just wait until the child wants something and says, I'd like to go over to my friends, and you say, wonderful, I'd like you to go, right after we have a conversation about the other night. And I think you need to emphasize this in that way to ensure that this conversation takes place. Now I'd like to address accountability. I suspect that accountability has been presented to you as the idea of assuming responsibility for what you do. And we're going to make somebody be accountable for what they do. Well, first of all, you can't make anybody be accountable because accountability is something that a person thinks or feels and is willing freely to assume. Secondly, the idea of accountability is not something often that you can impose. Real accountability instead involves freedom to choose. Now, rather than leaving teenagers totally on their own to choose or being permissive or whatever, parents who lead their children with this form of leadership will often delineate what the options are for their children with the consequences in mind, and then ask their children to inform them of the choices they make. So in my case, for example, we remove all the curfews because we live in an area that's relatively safe. And so we say, well, what time do you think you should be in tonight? And they'll say, and if we don't like it, I'll say, no, make something else. Until finally they choose something that is within our realm, half hour, an hour close to what we would like. And then there are other situations where they say, well, let's talk about this. This is a choice you need to make about this, please. I'll help you with it, and keep talking until they feel comfortable. Now, helping your children learn to be good decision makers is a gradual process. And at the first of this period, you still will exert greater influence, but gradually turn children's lives over to them. In fact, we want to turn them. Sometimes we are so controlling to kids that by the time they get 18, they can't leave because they want to be around and be told what to do. In fact, I've learned that successful parents often organize a plan with their children so they take more control of their lives as a part of this stage or period. So my point to you is that let's just take it proactively and say, this is what we want. We want you to be responsible and in charge of your own life, and let's take a look at what that means. Just the other day, I found that a woman is waking up her 17-year-old son every morning. He doesn't get up, she goes back, and so on. And I said, would you mind not doing that? He has a phone, let him use the alarm on the phone, and for the next 2 or 3 days, maybe a week, would you awaken him at the wrong time? And she said, what do you mean? And I said, well, since it's getting darker early in the morning, go in and wake him up at 4:30. And he'll get up thinking it's time. And then when he finds that out, he'll say, why did you wake me up? And you say, well, first of all, I can't be trusted as much as usual. And it seems to me that it might be a good thing for you to awaken yourself. And then you do it 2 or 3 more times to drive home that point so that he catches on that it's just simply better to do it himself. I was talking in a counseling session the other day with a husband. He's probably in his mid-30s, and I was asking him if he'd be willing to start a few conversations with his wife. He came back and said he had done that, and I said, what did you learn? And he said, I learned that when I start things, they tend to turn out better. I don't know how long it takes all of us to get that idea, but it certainly was time for him to, because it helped solve a lot of problems. Now, once you've started helping children make more of their decisions on their own, you can introduce them and expose them to the idea that they'll be accountable. So all you have to do is talk about the consequences and help them understand what the consequences are for the choices they make. Positive ones, mostly. Here's some good things that will happen because of this decision, and here are some bad things. And then work with them a little bit at a time, like, well, what would you do here? What would the following consequences be if you did that? Then review with after a decision was carried out. Did you tell me? Did it happen what you think would happen? Something good was happening, then validate that by saying, listen, these good things happened because you did, and you are a good person. This little conversation process allows you to be firm, flexible, conversant, and expect accountability.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the First Answers podcast, which is sponsored by firstanswers.com, where you can find new tools for families and parents of 21st century kids, with a focus on emotional self-reliance. Find First Answers on Facebook, and remember to subscribe to stay up to date with new episodes. Give us a rating and write a review on the Podcasts app or Google Podcasts, and let us know what you think about First Answers. Check out another podcast by Dr. Scoresby called The Christ Questions, which is centered on questions we ask about Jesus Christ and questions he asks us. Dr. Scoresby examines how Christians can build faith in Jesus Christ that lasts and discover the true blessings and rewards for believing.